Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video what I'd like to discuss is the emergency legislation that has been passing through Parliament on the nod, probably fairly quietly given that so many other things are much more urgent, newsworthy. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I had talked recently, and I may have mistalked on this, of the need for emergency legislation to deal with what is, let's face facts, unprecedented. Yes, we have emergency legislation in theory. We have the Emergency Powers Act, which allows the government in an emergency, various powers subject to parliamentary approval after a couple of weeks at least. But the government have put through a bill running to several hundred pages of measures in order to contain the current crisis. Now, there are those legal experts who do not believe that we need these measures. Not that if you read them, because there's certainly sections in there you say, absolutely, yeah, the government needs to be able to do this and they need to be able to do this. The problem, well, there's a few problems with it. The first problem is, wouldn't those same measures be covered by existing legislation? And it would actually seem so, as I'm not a legal expert, but at the same time, we are currently in a bit of a lockdown at the moment. So the Prime Minister was already able to apply a police-enforced lockdown on us. Now, several of the measures he has already implemented at the time at which I'm doing this video, and I don't know when you'll be able to see it because funny things going on with YouTube, but at the time at which I'm doing this bill hasn't passed through. It's not law, and it's not likely to be law for a few days at least. So he's done it with existing legislation. So there's a number of measures in the new legislation. You think, well, that's all perfectly reasonable. But we've already seen some of them implemented, which then makes you think, well, these legal experts who are saying we don't need any of the measures in this new bill, then why are we going through with it? Bearing in mind that Boris Johnson clearly did want to perform an executive power grab. He attempted it twice last year. In his manifesto for the general election, the old famous page 48 does lay out a number of ways in which he wants to move us towards a form of dictatorship, quite frankly. Removing the power of the judiciary, removing the independence of the judiciary, certainly, and also removing many of the powers of Parliament. Before this crisis ever emerged, he was already talking about Parliament sitting much less than it already does, for example. He doesn't want to be subject to scrutiny. I worry that he is seeing this as a political opportunity to do that. Now, there's a few things that it's worth bearing in mind. One particular expert, and I will put a link to this document in the comments below, noting on a few things. So health and social care, for example, it says, this bill includes refusal to treat and the requirement for charges to those requiring social care who can otherwise opt to go without treatment, which are not limited to when and where there are large numbers of corona cases. So what that's basically saying is the council will no longer have a duty of care to, for example, the elderly or vulnerable for social care. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but surely the purpose of these measures, the lockdown that has now been implemented, is essentially to protect the vulnerable and the elderly who are most at risk. It's not to protect the majority of us who, quite frankly, could treat this as probably a little bit like flu, although we shouldn't. We are being told not to. But for the majority of people who contract it, it may be no worse than flu and may actually not even be that bad if you've got a fit and healthy respiratory and immune system. So why would you introduce legislation that is supposed to be there to protect the vulnerable members of society against the stupid behaviour of the rest of us, and then put in something that removes the safety net for those very people? The next thing, which would also be quite worrying, which is to do with police and immigration officer detention. So it says here, there is a basis for detaining potentially infectious people. Now, the reasoning for this is, so let's say you've got someone who is potentially infectious and they're ignoring the orders to stay home, basically, and self-isolate. Gives the police powers to arrest them and force them to have a test. Now, we already know that that is not necessary because that effectively already is the case. In fact, never mind whether we may be infected or not, everyone's in lockdown, and that is police enforced with current legislation, not this legislation. This legislation is not in place yet. It's still a bill passing through Parliament, although it's gone through the Commons. It'll go through on the nod. By the time you see this, it may even be law, but it wasn't at the time the lockdown was enforced, and it's not at the point at which I'm doing this. Also notes here, so, you know, if the basis for detaining is the person is or may be infected, as the person says here, that means everyone in the UK. Because any of us may be infected, we don't know because we're not routinely testing. Also, this idea that it's there so that we can make that person have a test so we know. We're not testing people. It notes here, there is no public outcry at the thought of being tested for this. We don't have the facility. Someone else pointed out, actually, that given that McDonald's has made the decision to close, maybe we could do what South Korea does and use their premises for drive-through testing. No, we're not testing. We're not testing anywhere near enough. So this seems strange. And this bill would allow police to detain for up to 48 hours compared to 24 hours for now. And for what? You know, they can say, oh, we think you may be infected. Right? Are you going to test me then? Oh, we don't have any tests, sorry. So we're just going to keep you here for 48 hours. So, you know, police for some other purpose may wish to detain someone for 48 hours for whatever reason and may just do it by saying, well, we think you're infected. And that'll be it. That'll be the end of it. There'll be nothing more they can do about it. Immigration officers can detain for up to 12 hours, it says with this. And it does say here, you know, given wide calls and individual requests for testing, it's unclear why this power is needed. It's not like people are refusing to be tested. It says healthcare professionals may already screen, assess and impose isolation on those they suspect of having this virus under the February 2020 Health Protection Coronavirus Regulations. So again, you don't need this extra legislation to do that anyway. Then, of course, we come to the ministerial power. Now, this has been slightly amended. So Boris Johnson wanted this legislation in place for 2 years. He didn't want it subject to any parliamentary scrutiny. If it was to be extended or amended, ministers would have the power to do that. So in other words, it could have gone forever. This is a bill that allows the government to actually impose a dictatorship because it can extend it as it wants. Think about this. You might be thinking to yourself, well, at some point, this virus situation is going to be under control. At that point, though, those powers will fail. No, this emergency can last for years because after the viral emergency, and we don't know when that will clear up, it may be a year and a half. That's a reasonable expectation. I'm not saying this full lockdown will be in place for a year and a half, but the emergency may be in place for a year and a half because it may take that long for us to be able to access a vaccine. And but after that, you've got the economic emergency. That's going to last for years. And again, they may say, well, some of these measures are going to be needed for the economic emergency. Some or all of the measures. And they'll just seek to extend it. Now, Labour did want a compromise in that it would be reviewed by Parliament after 6 months. The government have agreed to that. So that is now in the bill. So it will now not just be 2 years of Boris Johnson doing whatever the hell he likes. Parliament will judge it in 6 months. But I'm going to suggest that in 6 months, this, let's face facts, majority Conservative Parliament is going to allow it to be extended again for another 6 months because we are still going to need some measures, even though it seems now increasingly clear, and we have got legal experts saying, none of the measures in this bill are needed because all of the measures that look reasonable already exist. They already exist and indeed have been used before this ever became law. Now, naturally, Boris Johnson says that this is only for the purpose of dealing with this emergency and that the powers will be dropped as soon as the emergency is no longer in place. We've heard that before, haven't we? If we explore our little dusty recesses of history, we've heard that said before, haven't we? So that gives me no confidence at all. But anyway, there it is. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people hadn't really heard too much about this, because at the end of the day, well, the news is not exactly reporting it at the moment. It may have to when Boris Johnson starts to use it for other purposes, and it will be extremely important that people keep an eye on exactly what he's using it for. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, and if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.